Elizabeth Comen, who is an award-winning clinician, citizen scientist, author, and a medical doctor in oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering, New York, specializing in breast cancer.
You really memorized this. I'm like, you are on it.
She's a rock star. I'm so excited about this talk. And in all her free time between all those things and being a professor at Cornell Weill Medical College and raising children, she also wrote this amazing book, which is a powerful call to a new conversation about women's health and advocating for ourselves and equity in women's health care. And Amy Epstein is also here today to be in conversation with her, the founder and director of the Lynn Cohen Foundation, whose mission is all about combating breast and ovarian cancer in women. She's raised $28 million since she began the foundation. And her goal is gathering people, education, and prevention. So we're so excited to hear more and help us be stronger in our doctor's appointments.
Yes. Okay. This is so fun. Hi. My maiden name is Cohen, so I think I'm going to
just say swap a letter.
Comen. Yeah. Anyways, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Sam, for having us. And just 2 seconds about me and what I do. I've run the Lynn Cohen Foundation for 26 years. It was created after my mom passed away from ovarian cancer when she was 53. And we have preventive care clinics for women who are at increased risk for breast ovarian cancer, actually 2 in New York at NYU and Bellevue. But in the last 10 years, I've really honed in on all the money we raise goes to our clinics, but I've really tried to hone in on the educational platform of the foundation and encouraging women of all ages, sizes, shapes, and forms to be their own best advocates and to take control of their health and wellness. And what I found by doing lots of these, dozens of these, in this kinds of settings and webinars and seminars and consortiums, that women in particular actually are more forthright with asking questions, sometimes really personal, intimate medical questions in these settings than with their doctor alone in their doctor's office, which like blows my mind and has always blown my mind. Somehow in my head, like if you're 15, that's okay not to ask your gynecologist something. But when I talk to women in their 60s, 70s, 80s who are like, oh, I would never bring that up. It kind of startles me, which is why I'm so passionate about this and why I was so excited when Sam asked me to talk to you today. So I'm hoping everyone has at least skimmed this book, if not read it in depth, because it's so awesome. I couldn't put it down all weekend.
There's no quizzes though.
No,
don't worry.
I think there should be actually. Maybe in high school there should be. So I'm going to jump right into this and get going. And the first thing I wanted to talk to you about was this apologizing woman. And maybe I could call it like an apologizing women syndrome. And why, how, what does that mean? Why do we do this? And why shouldn't we do this?
Oh, you're really going right for it.
I am. So
for anybody who hasn't read the book, there's no shaming because, women get shamed very easily. The book, All in Her Head, is a walk through women's bodies by organ system, much like the specialties that we have today, like gastroenterology and cardiology. But it's also a walk through history to show the shame, but also the legacy of apologizing that so many women I've experienced in my practice, taking care of thousands of women, but also throughout history, this idea that we are to either blame for our illness, we should be embarrassed for being sick, we should feel shame around it. And for me, one of the many emotional impetus of the book was really just the pervasive apologizing I found myself doing, but only when I really paid attention to the patients that I was caring for, even with breast cancer, apologizing for normal bodily functions in the doctor's appointment. And I just felt that, it's time for that to change.
You talk, there's, your viral quotes about women apologizing because they're sweating.
Yeah.
I've definitely done that. I've been like, I'm sorry, I'm so sweaty. Obviously I'm nervous when, your doctor's like up here feeling like, oh, it's so insane.
Yeah. So one of the things that happened when I thought about writing this book was I had a medical student with me. And, when you have a medical student, you're always like a little bit more, let me make sure they learn something and the art of medicine. And I noticed that there was one woman who had just been diagnosed with breast cancer, just came from the surgeon, was coming to see me and, asked these questions. Am I going to die? Am I going to be okay? Which are what everybody always asks. And then I went to examine her, and she was just profusely apologizing for sweating, which is a normal, natural reaction in the setting of stressful, scary news, including being at the doctor's office and being told that you have cancer. And then I started to notice with this medical student, gosh, every woman has apologized to me today. And then, of course, the book opens with a woman on her deathbed apologizing to me for sweating. And she is not the first person nor the last person to do that in my practice. And, it's heartbreaking. And I don't think that men experience the same sense of shame around illness and or the same level of apologizing.
So where does that come from, being a medical historian? Like, do we know where it comes from? Is it how we're taught to be as women? Is it something in the sort of medical profession?
Well, that's exactly why I wrote the book,
I know.
to really highlight these
Thank God.
stories about women throughout history, to try to understand this idea of controlling women's bodies, how we should behave, how we should act in life, in illness, in health, in sex, in motherhood, and all the ways that we are confined and told to behave, that then when we are not that picture of beauty, or we are not that picture of contained, or we are not that picture of behaved in a doctor's office or in society, there is this need to be smaller or apologize because we're not fitting into some image of who we should be.
So how do we change it?
Well, it starts by conversations like this.
Yeah.
I mean, people often ask, and if my agent is here, well, were you going to write a descriptive book or a prescriptive book? Is this going to be a how-to guide and a 10-step wellness? And I really did not want this book to be that, but rather an opening to a new conversation around your health. One of the things about being an oncologist is that it is the type of field that requires not just in and out care. You're not just getting fixed for a broken bone or getting Botox from your dermatologist. These are lifelong relationships we have with our patients. And it really speaks to the experience of illness. And the experience of illness is one of narrative medicine. Two women can have the exact same diagnoses with breast cancer, but how they experience that biology is what really makes illness what it is, and the narrative component of the stories that we tell ourselves. So the reason why this book is so story-driven is the idea that maybe you can recognize pieces of yourself in these stories of women, even going all the way back to the Greeks or 17th century Old English. And in that, if you recognize pieces of yourself that maybe you don't want to be telling yourself anymore, can you have a new narrative around your health after reading this book?
So will you give us just a little bit of history and background as to how and why you really became, I would say, a medical historian?
Yeah.
And how old were you? Like, how did this start?
So when I was in high school, actually, I had a love of history, a love of reading, a love of writing, but I also was passionate about science and the power and language of the discrete aspects of math and science and how you could use them to solve problems. But I think very early on, I was also interested in how the context of how science and the mindset with which we discover science. There tends to be this fallacy that science is just this all-knowing truth, right? That math is just perfect in that way. But the reality is the questions we ask, the scientific things that we become interested in, the medicine that we care about or don't care about, the way women's health is underfunded, is completely a function of the culture, the society, the history that imbues what we do. So I got in early to Harvard, but even before then, I knew they had a history of science concentration. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to be a part of that. There was another high school student that had majored in it. It was a relatively new concentration there. And it really allowed me to not only pursue the science that I was interested in, but understand how science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And you really see that play out in our healthcare system today with the fact that women's healthcare, female predominant diseases are entirely underfunded, misunderstood. We don't even consider some of the most important women's health issues. 80% of autoimmune diseases are in women, but do we consider that a women's health issue? No, we've reduced it to just what society sees as women's health, which is our uterus, our reproductive function, and our breasts, when really it's so much more.
Yeah. And going into the idea of uterus, reproductive system, and our breasts, to me, that's a piece of it as to why I think women are so shy, apologetic, mm-hmm. and apprehensive to get into it, mm-hmm. because I think we're taught at such a young age, those are your private parts.
Yeah.
Cover them up and don't look at them, don't touch them, don't think about them. They'll deal with you when you start your period. And I don't think we're given those tools, mm-hmm. of relating them to actually as part of ourselves. Mm-hmm. They're attached to us. They are part of our bodies. and then talking about them, not just with each other, but in your doctor's office.
Of course. I mean, there's a pervasive, long, sordid history of shaming women's bodies head to toe, even going back, to the Greeks, that we are inverted, imperfect, distorted versions of this ideal reference man. And you see that play out into the types of studies that are done today, right? It wasn't until 1993 that women were even included in clinical trials, or going back to looking at preclinical models to develop drugs are often in male mice. Well, that doesn't help us, right? We have to go from the laboratory to the clinic and think about how we are not small men and how we need to demand better care for our own diseases and our own ailments. But the shaming is pervasive throughout history. I did this podcast yesterday called Clitorology, and it was great with this woman, Jacqueline Buckingham. But one of the things she was saying is, if you Google the word, if you look in the dictionary for like slang, clit comes up as vulgar slang. But everything referenced to male genitalia is just referred to as slang without the use of the word vulgar. And so this language, language reveals character. Language reveals what we mean and what we think and how we feel. And even just the use of the word vulgar before slang in female versus male genitalia really tells you where we're at still. And one of the things about writing this book is, yes, there are these egregious, horrible stories from the past, but I think it's almost worse to think about how they insidiously show up today in subtle ways that we don't even recognize because they're hidden.
Yeah. You use the word incuriosity in your book, and I don't think I've ever heard that before, and I loved it, circled it, highlighted it. Just get into that with me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just hi, welcome. It's not even just incuriosity. It's an insidious incuriosity that, and when you read the book, you see that I'm not male bashing. I'm not trying to say that we need only women in medicine by any means. But we have to accept the reality that men largely built the healthcare system that we live in today. And as a function of that, even the best of men with the best of intentions were not necessarily focused on things that didn't affect them. So an example of that might be postmenopausal women are more likely to suffer from a condition called frozen shoulder, right? And the historic treatment of that condition was what we call benign neglect. The idea being that just ignore it, it'll get better. You can't move your arm, it's super painful, but it'll get better. There's no world where, if that happened to a man, that it would just be throughout history, the primary treatment for it would just be ignore it, dear. Ignore it, dear.
And of course, override.
Yeah. And now we know, it's all in your head. And now we know, of course, there are so many ways to treat this because we've had more women physicians take interest and say, this is not acceptable. So I think it's an incuriosity, but it's an insidious incuriosity that is at best a function of just not being affected by the same diseases, and at worst, really, infiltrated by shame and all the other negative connotations.
100%. I mean, there's this idea that when we, as women in particular, we get into a doctor's office, and you look up and you see your diplomas, and this is the person who knows better. Like, this is the person who's gone to school for this and been in training and has the experience. Why would I question this person?
Yeah.
Why would I say, when they say to me, there's nothing wrong with you, it's all in your head, or, you think it's this, but it's really not, you're fine. And the number of women I've spoken to over the years who who've been walking around with giant tumors in their bellies, and their doctors have said, you just need to play a little more tennis and go for longer walks. You're getting older, you're gaining weight. It happens to be right here in this sort of belly region, but it's fine. It doesn't always mean you have ovarian cancer, but for these women it did. But their strength in saying, no, something's wrong with me. This is not normal. There's more going on. And walking away with that diagnosis from that doctor for a really long time until it gets so bad that they, go see someone else.
Yeah. I think what you're speaking to is another aspect of the book, which is that ovarian cancer is historically called a silent killer.
Yeah.
It's not a silent killer. We just haven't been listening to women. And that is a, extreme, horrible example of the healthcare system needs to listen to women as opposed to impose its pain scales, its symptom management. Another less mortality focused diagnosis is irritable bowel syndrome,
Yeah.
right? It may not be life and death, but it really, really affects women and female women predominantly. But historically, there was no lexicon to really scale for trials, bloating, pain. And it was more male doctors really saying, oh, this is what you feel, kind of check this off, as opposed to asking the women, how would you describe your symptoms yourself? And one of the newer drugs, Linzess, really came out of a male doctor pushing science and pushing pharmaceutical companies to say, let's listen to women first, how they describe their symptoms, and then from there, develop the trial as it should be. And so it's another example of this idea that women's symptoms and experiences are not silent if we actually listen.
Absolutely.
And the other point, you're really talking about trusting your gut and the intuition that if something's not right, to advocate for yourself.
Yeah.
In the ideal setting, we don't want it to be that we can't go to doctors who have gone to school for eons, since like the dinosaur era is what it feels like before you finally have a degree and can practice medicine. There is a lot of knowledge that's there. It's just we need to be able to listen to women at the same time and say, well, tell me what you mean by that. In early on in your training, you learn very quickly that if someone actually comes into the hospital and says, I'm dying, that you have to listen to that, because something horrible is very few people actually say, I'm dying.
Except my husband.
Oh,
he has
when he has a man cold.
Actually, I'm dying. I'm never going to make it through this.
That's a unique diagnosis.
But he's not here, so we can talk.
Yeah, there's even a billing code for that. But it sort of speaks to this idea that your body best, and you have to be able to partner with a doctor, with a healthcare system that's actually going to honor what you are concerned about and be able to have that dialogue to access their best health for you as well, and answer and dig and understand what's going on with you.
Yeah. And as hard as it will be to change the healthcare system in our country, I think you have to start with yourself and us, and having that level of self-advocacy and self-awareness, and then also confidence to be that person who says, maybe I'm not dying, but if you feel like you're dying, then to say that and then to be treated as such.
Yeah. I think we also need someone to join us at a doctor's office, especially if you have a new diagnosis or you're really anxious about something. It's incredibly hard to process that information, new information that's coming in. Wonder is, oh my God, does my doctor like me? It's hard. It's really, really hard.
It's hard. I mean, I tell women a lot to write it down, like write down every single question before you go in, because you will freeze up. You won't remember, or you'll be too nervous to ask them. But if they're like in front of you, maybe you'll ask those questions. But having someone with you who you trust and love, I think is absolutely a wonderful idea and alternative, which I don't think many of us would do, like naturally. Say, Sam, will you come with me to my gynecology appointment or to my mammogram or ultrasound? Like, I need someone there. I don't think we do that. Why don't we do that? All knowing. Yeah.
I think better than why we don't is to say, how do we do it moving forward? And I think that's in part what this mission of the book is about. It's not just about a book, but a greater mission about having women to have allies with them, whether it's men or women, making sure you feel comfortable advocating for yourself or having someone there to advocate with you, having questions that you make sure get answered.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. There's a part of the book where you talk about diets. And I want to get into that and sort of why you talk about it, why you spent time on it.
Sure.
Go for it.
How's LA doing with the Ozempic craze that's all over New York City?
Well, I'll tell you something interesting. I lived in the Middle East for 5 years. I lived in Abu Dhabi, and my husband is there a lot for work. And you can get it there, as a lot of places, without a doctor's prescription. And so most of the men he knows, not women actually, are on Ozempic for a quick 10-pound loss. And
that's a book in and of itself.
I mean, So you just walk into any pharmacy and get it. And I'm not poo-pooing Abu Dhabi or their healthcare system. It's actually really wonderful, but this is a little interesting. And he had, I tell him about, these women, all these women on Ozempic, and he's like, no, come on, not that many people. And then his last trip back, he was like, oh my God, 5 of my friends are on Ozempic and their whole face changed. Like they, last time I saw him was 6 weeks ago and they've lost 10, 15 pounds.
Yeah.
So
I think it speaks to a broader theme about women and women's bodies in culture. And for the vast majority of history and in Western medicine culture, there has never been a narrative that has extolled the strong woman. We idealize the small, dainty, frail, consumptive woman dying of tuberculosis, so pale, so frail, so breathless, so romanticized as beautiful, heroine chic. Right? There's different flavors of this throughout history, of the woman who's delicate and dainty and not hungry and able to control what she eats, and oh my gosh, never eat a burger, as being an idealized version of beauty. And I think that plays out throughout medicine. And if you look at, there was a diagnosis at the turn of the 19th century during the Victorian era called chlorosis, which was probably some amalgam of iron deficiency anemia, but came about because, especially during the Victorian era, the idea of women eating red meat, reading romantic novels, and being somehow excitable was a massive problem. And you see that these cultural influences play out actually into medical diagnoses, like fainting salts, these women that were so frail that they needed to be resuscitated with fainting salts. They were all probably anemic to some degree. And really fitting into this model of what would be beautiful. So I bring up these historical ideas to highlight, okay, well, we've got this Ozempic craze today, certainly where I live. And what is that doing to women? And I'm not talking about the epidemic of obesity in this country, where we've got massive rates of diabetes and heart disease, where yes, it absolutely has a life-saving role for some of those patients. I'm talking about the women that feels like she needs to be a size 2 and lose 5 pounds, and that's the only way for her to do it. And this pressure to look thin as opposed to be strong. Many of these women are developing osteoporosis at an accelerated rate. They're losing muscle mass, which in turn is going to age them. Purely from a vanity standpoint, they're losing fat in their face. And so what beauty ideals, what health ideals are we actually striving for here, and what are we missing in the mark? I think a lot.
I don't know. I know a lot of women on Ozempic, and I don't know any of them that are diabetic, pre-diabetic. Like, there's no medical actual diagnosis besides it's a good way to lose weight.
Right.
And I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody, but it's like that Ozempic face. It is. It's like when we get older, we lose, as in general, our faces get thinner, but it's like happens so quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just worry about the long-term consequences for these women. And what, there's this chase of beauty, but what about longevity? What about, having strong bones? What about it having strong muscles? One of the things that many women may not be aware of is that it's not just about being thin with respect to your health, but what is your fat to muscle ratio, and the importance of strength training, especially as we get older, especially having good protein intake as we get older to develop that muscle mass, so that when you fall, you don't break a bone and end up in a hospital and then in a nursing home and an accelerated death because of all that cascade.
Yeah. And building muscle mass when you're younger and getting that as part of your habit it's so much more important than physical, like how you look aesthetically, but it is like one of the big things that you can take control of and do for yourself, or encourage young women to do, is build muscle mass in your 20s and 30s, and then have that be part of your routine.
There's a great book called Let's Get Physical. I'm seeing who's smiling. I knew it was you. I knew it was you, because you're leaning in with that prideful energy. You're very sweet.
Something special.
Yes.
We've all been dismissed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when I read Danielle's article, it really, and I told a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'm going to continue to tell them.
So her daughter-in-law is the incredible Danielle Friedman, who wrote the New York Times piece about the book and the work, but she wrote a book. I fangirled her long before she ever contacted me. I knew about her work because she wrote this amazing book called Let's Get Physical, about the history of women and fitness, and, do Pilates because you're going to have long, sleek muscles, and cardio so that you're, thin, but very little about how we strength train. The other day I was looking at this new Pilates studio on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I was all excited. It was nearby, and I looked at frequently asked questions. And one of the first questions was, will I get bulky from exercise? Why are we still asking this freaking question? Am I going to have bulky muscles? No, you're not going to turn into Arnold Schwarzenegger from doing Pilates. But if you look back in history about even, I open in the muscular chapter about the history of women in bicycle riding. Bicycles were a symbol for the suffragist movement. They were a chance for women to leave the home when they were developed because, they didn't need a horse and buggy. You could get on a bike and go to the countryside by yourself. And doctors became moral arbiters about what women could do in this new fitness craze, and said, well, you're going to develop these bulky muscles and your face is going to be frozen in a grimace from all this exertion. And
yes, and then there's all this other stuff about riding a bike.
You're going to ride it to
rubbing
the wheel.
your vagina on a bike.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. That's apparently why I'm on my Peloton all the time.
Yeah, totally.
It's like one
if
constant
that
orgasm.
happened to me, I'd be like,
yeah.
woo!
It's like, has anyone actually
Giving up my
cycled? That's
car.
not happening. Yeah. Yeah.
I
Ride
love
it till
that.
the wheels fall off.
Ride it to those. It's like, I won't get into that, but there's some funny ones we could talk about that. But actually, that's what I was going to ask next, or actually close with. So you beat me to it. But one of the other things I wanted to talk about was sort of the gut-brain connection that you talk a lot about. I mean, you mentioned IBS, and then the gut being sort of next to our sexual organs, and what that means, and sort of how that plays out in women's bodies.
Well, I think what was really kind of surprising in doing this research was just how much women's sexual desire, libido, the fear of it, the need to control it, was woven throughout medical history about what male doctors said about women. Everything from scoliosis to constipation was either a result of you wanting sex or not having enough sex. It was like, damned if you do, damned if you don't. There's nothing in between. You're all screwed. Unless you only want to have sex exactly when your husband says you should.
And he's in the mood.
Yeah, and he's in the mood. So, I mean, there's so much that went into that gut chapter, but I think it also points to, we know that there is a gut-brain connection. We know that there are brain-like cells in our gut. But during the rise of medical specialization, because, medicine was not what it is today at the turn of the 19th century. In the mid 1800s, we didn't have germ theory. We didn't have medical schools with rigorous standards as we do now. But as that rose, women were pushed out from healing specialties, right? That feminine spirit was sidelined. And I say all of this because then we developed these very fragmented fields like urology, cardiology, gastroenterology. And gastroenterology, if you think, is just kind of focused on the gut. But again, pointing back to the idea of the philosophy of science and the history of science and why that matters, and mindset, is if you're just kind of focused in this cut and dry, fragmented, divide the body into parts way, you lose sight of all these connections that I think women are really chasing in our healthcare system now, which is the idea of, how do we have holistic care? How do we feel like it's actually integrated? How do we feel like our cardiologist is thinking about how this affects our fitness level, or our gastroenterologist is thinking about my overall mental health? And just now are we starting to see how these fields are more integrated, which they've always been. This is not new. It's just our healthcare system has not allowed for that.
That's interesting. I never really put that together, that when our healthcare system got sort of specialized, which sounds fabulous.
Yeah.
Like, you want a doctor who specializes on the heart and knows that to be dealing with your heart. But
we lose something in that.
We totally lose something in that. And we're not just pieces. We're one person, and everything is connected.
Right.
100%.
Yeah.
I know we're getting close on time. So I wanted to just end with one thing before we open up to questions, which is that you talk about that toward the end of your book, which is vaginal health. And I remember when I was young, my mom I think she had those wipes that were like douche wipes.
Yeah. Did they have Lysol in them?
Probably. I mean, probably. And I think all these things led to her cancer. But I think, and I remember I have two older sisters, and we were like, that's disgusting. We are not putting anything that smells like that near our vaginas. And she was like, it keeps it clean and fresh. And we were like,
yeah,
that's so gross, without even thinking about, like, that is so bad for you.
Yeah.
And it's still, you go to the market, any place, and it's like, quite prevalent.
There's so many companies that are capitalizing again on this shame.
Yeah.
And the idea that you're unclean and women are dirty. If you look at the history of sexually transmitted diseases and what we've done to women and said about women, it's always the dirty woman. I spent a long time watching archives from the National Library of Medicine of videos about syphilis and other STDs, particularly during wartime, when the concern was all these dirty women that looked clean were going to infect men, not that the men were infecting the women. And at some point, as part of the American plan, there's a great book called The Trials of Nina McCall by Scott Stern. And it's about what most people don't know about, which is that women were imprisoned for years in this country, you could be imprisoned if you were on a bus by yourself, in a store by yourself, you looked promiscuous, and then be forcibly checked for syphilis. And even before we had adequate treatment for syphilis, treated with mercury, arsenic, your teeth could fall out from that, simply because forcibly examined and incarcerated at these containment camps where they were treating women for supposed syphilis. They were not doing these same sorts of treatments to men, because the idea was we needed to clean up all the women. And then, of course, today you have all of these products that are completely unnecessary, but capitalize on this idea that we are somehow unclean.
Yeah.
Whether it's just an everyday function or women having their period, it's really horrible. And there's a long history of ads for this, right?
Mm-hmm.
She was so perfect, she was so beautiful, except for her feminine hygiene, and that's why she lost her husband. These ads are, humorous to look at it at first glance, but really tragic, ultimately,
Damaging.
very damaging.
Yeah.
And of course, we know a history with talcum powder
Mm-hmm.
and all sorts of issues there with respect to ovarian cancer.
Just stopping what your body's naturally supposed to do with things that are unhealthy that we smother on is so. It's like kind of silly-ish, and then but it's like it's damaging, and most of those products are, meant to clean your house with toxic chemicals.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, now that we've talked about vaginas, I think we
We can
should
talk about it all day long.
I know. Well,
We're not shy.
Definitely not. And I remember the very first time I switched from we always saw a male gynecologist growing up. That was the doctor my mom sent us to.
My first gynecologist was named Dr. Gross.
Yeah, that's fun. Mine was Dr. Toe. So Toe Gross is even worse. And then my sisters and I were like, why are we seeing a male gynecologist? This is so crazy. I'm going to see a female. And the very first time I saw my now gynecologist, I said, I'm so sorry. Like, I have not waxed myself. And she's like, seriously? Like, I really don't care I'm not looking at that. I'm looking up in there. And I was like, yeah, you are. Like, why do you care if I, am a week off my waxing schedule? And obviously you talk all about that in so many ways of being apologetic and just feeling insecure and thinking you have to show up to a doctor's appointment looking like prim and proper and beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen it all.
Yeah.
You literally don't care and not looking. It doesn't make a difference.
We don't care at all.
Yeah. I think I once apologized for not having a pedicure. It was like, I guess I was in my 20s, right? And so I blame it on that. But why? Why would that be like that? Why would we be taught or told or mentored or thought that that's how we should walk in and be apologetic for something wrong with ourselves, that we're not prim, proper, and totally put together? So with that, I think we should open up for questions and anything you want to ask.
Hi.
Who would you recommend for medical school? What are you asking in medical school for doctors to be better trained? Because we can advocate, but until they come back with an open, curious mind, and they've been trained that they know best, etc. So are we starting at like the source of having doctors come out of medical school in a way that's communicative and collaborative?
Well, you're really speaking my love language, because I do want to help, and I am in the works of developing a curriculum for different medical schools. I think you're also speaking to this idea that I've heard, well, aren't we doing so much better? We have so many women in medical school. Okay, my med school class at Harvard had greater than 50% women graduating, and we're still dealing with the same, there's no way to skimp these words, same shit, right? If it doesn't matter if you have lots of women, female physicians, but they're not getting promoted, they're not getting honored for taking great care of patients, they're not having positions of leadership, they're not in positions to be helping to funnel money in the right ways towards research, it doesn't matter. You may have more boots on the ground, but we need to have more boots high up making real decisions. So I think I'm so tired of people saying, oh, but we have more women physicians. That's not good enough, right? So I agree with you. We need to honor what I call, and men and women can have this feminine spirit, right? Throughout the early stages of our current medical system, it was the idea, well, nurses care and doctors cure, right? There's no reason why we can't honor empathy and that feminine nature in both male and female physicians. It's not about just discovering a gene, but actually what it means to care for the next human being in front of you. And I think there are a lot of people interested in it. So I think it's twofold what needs to happen in medical schools. One, we need to inspire everybody to realize that women's health is not just gynecology, for God's sakes. If you're a cardiologist, you need to know about menopause. If you are a neurologist, you need to know about female-specific neurologic conditions, right? So making sure that we build into the system that women's chest pain when they present with a heart attack is not what I was taught as atypical. We're greater than 50% of the population. Our symptoms are typical for women. So it really starts with working with medical schools and changing that language and helping to develop curriculums that are not just electives for women to take, but required learning for everybody. And it also means that we need to make sure that from a philanthropic standpoint, that we're not just inspiring students to take interest in this, but that we are putting our money where our mouth is. And so, for example, there's the White House Research Initiative towards women's health, but they had no money as of a week ago. Now they have $100 million that's came out of a great conference that I was part of, and a lot of women's startups and private philanthropic groups getting involved. But we need to make sure in these medical schools where a lot of research is being done, that we are driving money towards women's health specific issues head to toe, and not just how we have babies or don't.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking of your point about female gynecologists and your point about medical school.
Mm-hmm.
There was an article a few years ago about how there are male gynecology residents who are upset
Yeah.
because they're sort of being
I remember that. That was like Washington Post or
Yeah.
something.
or they're being deterred from pursuing
Yeah.
gynecology. And in the article, it talked a little bit about how men have a perspective to bring to gynecology as well,
Mhm.
and how unfair this is to them that they can't become gynecologists, and that
Mhm.
residency programs aren't choosing them, and women aren't choosing them as their doctors. And I was like, I'm sorry, I can't get worked up about that. Like,
Yeah, we got a lot more work to do.
Of all the specialties, like the one that requires a uterus or focuses on the uterus and other parts.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry if find something else.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's great that there are men that are interested in it, and I think there's enough problems for us all to address, but that wouldn't be the first article that I'd be a part of.
Yeah.
I think as patients, we have to also, like you talk about in the book, as patients, we have to want that too. My son has biliary atresia.
Mm.
So we were in an ER once with a friend who had driven us there. And our doctor, who I considered really collaborative, was talking to me, and we were going back and forth and back and forth. And it wasn't presenting as a particularly clear case of cholangitis.
Mm-hmm.
And then when she left, my friend was like, does she know what she's talking about? She seemed really wishy-washy.
Mm.
And I was like, she's really collaborative. Like, we came to a decision together
Mhm.
based on my experience with my kid and
Mhm.
her experience with biliary atresia. But that was viewed by a third party as
Which is why is she asking you?
not doctor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
that's not doctor.
Well, I think there's this need in some settings for someone to just tell you what's wrong.
Mhm.
But I think a great doctor knows what they know and knows what they don't know. And when they present with that humility that you don't expect in today's medical system, which is largely been driven by a patriarchal model where I know what's wrong, I know what's best for you, it can be kind of confusing, right? To say, you know what, I'm not sure. I am going to get back to you. I need to get back to you because we have to figure this out and I need to involve other experts.
What about equity in healthcare? I mean, I know you certainly see a lot in terms of, maternal, deaths and,
Mm-hmm.
and so on in terms of racially
Mm-hmm.
very disparate.
Yeah. So what's woven through this book as well is that misogyny in medicine and racism in medicine have gone, unseemly hand in hand. At every aspect of medicine, minorities do worse. In my field, Black women are 40% more likely to die from breast cancer than any other ethnicity. And that really has nothing to do with in some measure, there's some discrepancies about the biology that may be in one group versus another. But primarily, when you look at what's driving these outcomes, it's access to care, it's bias when you reach a doctor. It shouldn't be that if you're a Black woman, you only get better care if you see another Black physician. It should be that anybody who you see is able to provide compassionate care. It also means we need to, on the flip side of that, make sure we have more diversity in our workforce. Only 3% of physicians are Black women, which is a huge problem, right? That doesn't reflect, it does not reflect, and it's even worse in depending on the specialty that you look at. And that simply does not reflect our society, right? And we have to have a workforce that reflects the society that we're caring for.
I think the other element of it too
Mhm.
is and maybe it's the racism piece of it, but it's also the dismissiveness
Yeah.
of especially Black women's pain and Black women's expression of symptoms, or, what I mean, when someone like, I can't remember if it's Venus or
Serena Williams presented with
Serena
a,
Williams knows what's wrong with her,
Yeah.
tries to tell a doctor and they don't listen,
So-
then you know you really have a problem.
So just for everybody's context, Serena Williams was giving birth. She had shortness of breath. She had chest pain, and she was very concerned that she had a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in her lungs. And she was dismissed repeatedly by different members of her healthcare team, only to find out that she was actually right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that happens all the time. And then, in the book, I talk about the history of Dr. Marion Sims. There's a long legacy of the assumption that Black women don't feel pain in the same way. So one of the most extraordinary, and I use that word in a nuanced fashion, developments early on in the field of gynecology was the repair of rectovaginal fistulas. So during childbirth, many women throughout history, and I open the urology chapter with a history of an Egyptian mummy that was discovered with having one of these fistulas. Basically, there's so much pressure in the vaginal canal that you develop a fistula, a connection between the rectum or the bladder and the vagina. So you could be having urine and feces come out of the vagina repeatedly. These women were dying of infections or living in squalor in their home, unable to leave their homes because of the way they smelled. Every time they stood up, everything would be coming out of them. And, there were blisters all over. It was a horrible, common condition. And Dr. Marion Sims was a doctor in the South that figured out a way to correct this, which revolutionized medicine, but he did so on the backs of Black slaves, operating on them with no anesthesia. Even when we knew that we had anesthesia at some point, the idea was that maybe white women need it more than Black women. These young girls underwent up to 30 surgeries, each of them in horrific I mean, we can't even fathom what type of pain these women experienced, yet for a medical advance. But how did we get there? And that's simply unacceptable. And it plays out into today's medical care today.
It does. I also think it's community based as well. I think within certain communities, there's ways in which we tell women how to act and how to be, and it gets passed down through generations of minimize your pain. In very, very in a handful of religions, in the very ultra religious, women are dirty, as we talked about earlier, because we menstruate, and so that like shame, and then being taught over the years and through generations of you don't talk about it if you feel pain down in your region, because you're dirty and you're a woman and I'm not going to touch you anyways. I think there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
And it's certainly unhelpful.
Question. Just in terms of like younger teenage girls, how would you suggest, like, how do we raise, this issue, it's so great that people are talking about it. I feel like I emailed you, like they're even talking about it in school about pain and girls, and it's not registering. But I noticed like the other day, my daughter had like an ingrown hair in her vagina, and she was like embarrassed to show me, didn't want to talk about it, and I'm like, this is your vagina, like, I'm like going overboard about it.
Good, go overboard.
But it's like, I don't want her to feel, I feel like there's just cultural shame around our bodies still, which I was talking to her about. I'm like, this is your body. Like, I'm so proud of you for showing me. Thank you for letting me look at it.
Yeah.
We want to work on this together so that this doesn't become something worse. Like, I feel like, how do we have that conversation in our homes? So,
well, you're doing it.
Well, how
you're
do we
doing
keep
it.
doing it better?
Yeah. I think we normalize it. We discuss with our friends the kind of conversations that we have. We don't stay silent in these moments in our home, but we share with our friends, hey, we did this, and maybe we'll feel a little bit more emboldened to have those conversations in our own homes when we need to. But I think it does start at home in so many ways, normalizing in the doctor's office, but also creating a shared narrative at home that our bodies are powerful and worthy of attention.
It's so sad. I'm like, wow, this is so.
Yeah.
There's still that thing, the private. I'm like, private. I'm like, no, it's not private.
I'm
like, that's for you. You own that. Like, be proud of it.
And don't like walk around in pain from a ingrown hair right next to you. No.
She was like, am I dying?
No, we
not
can't
dying.
fix this.
Sam, I would say that things are better than they were, because certainly with my daughter, like she's more open with me, and we have much more candid conversations than I ever do.
Oh,
with my
yeah.
mom, like
Yeah.
ever. And I think part of it's going to an all-girls school, but it's just all very normal. Like having your period is normal, having cramps is normal. Oh, I'm going to take an Advil because I'm having cramps, or I want to get a hot water bottle. It's like it's all, or oh gosh, mom, I feel crampy today. I think I'm going to get my period tomorrow. Like, I mean, it blows my mind the conversations we have compared to my daughter. And my mom
Yeah.
never talked about this stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
That's
it's
great.
It's starting. It's happening.
And it
Yeah.
needs not just to be girl parents, it needs
Oh,
to
yeah.
be boy parents.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there was an issue in Malibu schools where because of trans students, they were putting tampons in the boys' rooms.
Mhm.
And the outcry from parents.
From
of
parents,
male
but did the students really care?
I'm sure not.
That's the
Literally,
difference.
there were parents saying, like, do not offend my son's delicate sensibilities by having tampons in, I think we're doing a really good job with our daughters. We need to do a good job with our sons.
Mhm.
Well, and even like my husband, like she didn't want my husband to know. And I was like, Daddy can know. I said, it's really important for men to know.
Mhm.
And our partners have to know about our health. And like, don't be ashamed. Because that's another weird thing, I think, in relationships with men. How do we
Oh,
talk
yeah.
about our bodies
Mhm.
and feel comfortable?
Mhm. Mhm.
Even if you're a male doctor. I love my doctor.
Yeah.
Thank you for this really interesting discussion. So I wonder, the topic you've been talking about most, if you don't feel heard by your doctor or taken serious, what is your approach? Like, I mean, of course you're left to go to a different one, but if you experience the same thing over and over,
I think if you do experience it over and over again, a couple things to think about is one, what are the things that are not being addressed? Is this like scheduling issues and you're trying to ask your doctor about that? They're going to be too tired and they're not going to be. Sometimes people think that we're like all knowing and can figure all this stuff out about like when your next MRI can be. We can't, right? We're dysfunctional in some ways, right? So think about what you're really asking of your doctor. But if it's truly, and who can answer that? Is it the nurse practitioner, the scheduler? Maybe there's a way through to better understand who's on the care team who can triage this. But if it's really substantive and you don't feel like you're having the answers that you need, or you don't trust your doctor, you have to find a new doctor. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. Well, it's great that the medicine workforce is diversifying, and then I find a lot of my friends now, especially when they choose a primary care physician, they will, go with a female, and then someone with like a similar racial or cultural background, so they can understand the patients or like kind of the consumer story more. But at the same time, we all know, the industry itself is still very homogenous. So how do we find confidence in providers that, that might not truly represent our cultural or social background, and then that fear when we go into like choosing a provider.
Yeah.
And then, I work in healthcare, and then.
What do you do?
I'm an administrator for health systems.
Cool.
Yeah, surgery specifically. But
Uh-huh.
so I felt like I kind of know where to look. You look for reviews, and then you kind of ask people that I know about all these things. But again, as a consumer, I think it's pretty overwhelming. So any kind of advice on that?
I think the reviews are probably not the way to go, because think about it. When you love a restaurant, are you really putting in a review? And, there are a lot of times people are angry, or, sometimes they can be helpful, but I don't think reviews of doctors are actually the way to go. I think it's how you feel. Your health is also how you feel about whether you've been heard, whether you physically feel better, whether you're having attention to your symptoms. I think, sometimes giving a doctor a chance who may not, you think, have the same background as you, but you may be surprised. And I think that's a real example of trusting your gut. If you feel like you've walked out of that appointment and you've been heard and the things that you care about have been addressed, and that one question you always wanted to ask your doctor you felt comfortable asking, then you probably have the right fit.
Definitely.
We have a lot of books to sign.
Oh,
From
thanks.
your
Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you.
And I
Thanks for coming.
like Amy said is right. Like, these conversations are so important, and we're so grateful to have you here to answer questions about this. And we all go around the world and talk about this the way you both are. We'll keep the conversation going.
Keep it going. There's a real
Absolutely.
butterfly effect. Yeah.
Huge.
Starts small, but gets bigger.
Thank you
Yeah.
for all you do.
Thank you so
We're all
much.
really grateful.
Appreciate being here. Means a lot.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, ladies.
Shall I sign some of these?
And we should make our dudes in our life come to these events.
Yeah.
And my dad